It all started like any other peaceful day in the neighborhood. The sun was shining softly over the streets lined with neat houses, each with its own carefully tended garden. Birds chirped in the early morning, and the scent of fresh-cut grass lingered in the air. The homeowner had lived here for years and loved the calm and quiet of this community. Life was simple, predictable, and comfortable. Every morning they would take a cup of coffee out to the porch, watch the small children ride their bikes, and wave to neighbors passing by. It was the kind of neighborhood where people felt safe, where doors were rarely locked, and where everyone knew everyone else, or at least they thought they did, from the very beginning. The homeowner had been careful. They paid the HOA fees on time, never left garbage cans out past collection day, and made sure the lawn was mowed and flowers were tended. Every letter from the HOA was read carefully, every minor rule followed, and even small repairs were handled promptly. They wanted nothing more than to live quietly, enjoy their home, and respect the community guidelines. For years, it worked. Life was smooth, and the sense of security was comforting. But then, Karen arrived. She was new to the neighborhood, a woman in her 50s, with sharp features and an even sharper gaze that seemed to miss nothing. She quickly made herself known as someone who had very firm ideas about how things should be done. At first, the homeowner didn't think much of it. Every neighborhood has a few people who are particular about rules. It was easy to smile, nod politely, and keep interactions brief. Karen's initial complaints seemed small, almost trivial. She would mention a crooked mailbox here, a garden gnome there, or say that a neighbor's fence wasn't painted evenly. Most people brushed these off as harmless eccentricities. But for the homeowner, it was a small warning sign, a shadow of what was to come. The first real trouble began subtly. One afternoon, a letter arrived in the mailbox. It was an official-looking notice from the HOA referencing a violation that the homeowner hadn't even known existed. According to the letter, some minor detail in the garden did not comply with HOA regulations. The homeowner had followed every rule carefully, so the notice seemed strange. They double-checked their property, compared it to the community guidelines, and could not find any fault. Still, they responded politely, explaining that the property was in full compliance. It seemed to them a simple misunderstanding that could be easily corrected with communication. Karen, however, was not satisfied. She had already begun walking the streets, clipboard in hand, inspecting every house, as though she were on some mission. Every time she passed the homeowner's property, her gaze lingered just a little too long. She started sending emails and notes with increasing frequency, pointing out trivial matters, things that no reasonable person would consider violations. Perhaps a leaf had fallen onto the sidewalk, or a garden tool was left out for a few hours. Each note arrived with a tone that suggested urgency, as though a disaster would strike if the issue was not addressed immediately. At first, the homeowner tried to laugh it off. They replied politely, explaining that everything was in order, that small, temporary issues were unavoidable, and that they were committed to maintaining their home properly. But Karen did not stop. She escalated her efforts, moving from polite notes to warnings that sounded harsher and more threatening. The homeowner began to feel the first twinges of worry. They had never faced anything like this. In a neighborhood that was supposed to be safe and friendly, they were being scrutinized in a way that felt personal and invasive. Neighbors began to notice as well. Some whispered about Karen's obsession with rules. Others had quietly dealt with her complaints and seemed relieved that the homeowner was next. But the homeowner felt increasingly isolated. They were someone who had always trusted the community, someone who had believed in fairness and reason. To be singled out in this way was both surprising and deeply unsettling. Each day brought new letters, more emails, sometimes phone calls. Each one seemed designed to wear down their patience, to make them feel as though they were constantly under surveillance, despite the mounting pressure. The homeowner tried to remain calm. They documented every interaction, every note, every email. They took photos of the property regularly, keeping a record that everything was maintained according to HOA rules. They even spoke with other neighbors to confirm that their practices were standard and acceptable. It was tedious, exhausting work, but they understood that if this situation escalated further, they would need proof to defend themselves. For now, the goal was simply to survive each day without losing composure. Then came the day when Karen crossed a line. It was a warm afternoon when the homeowner noticed her standing across the street, arms crossed, scrutinizing the property with her usual intensity. This time, she was not alone. Another HOA member had accompanied her, and they both walked the property line with clipboards making notes. The homeowner approached, smiling politely, trying to diffuse the tension. "Hello," they said. "Is there something wrong?" Karen's response was cold, calculated. She pointed to a small patch of lawn near the corner of the yard and claimed it violated a regulation. She spoke in a tone that left no room for discussion, as if the homeowner were already guilty. The homeowner, bewildered, tried to explain that everything had been maintained according to HOA rules, but Karen interrupted, dismissing the explanation entirely. It was clear that logic and reason would not sway her. What had once seemed like minor interference had transformed into targeted harassment. The homeowner retreated inside, shaken but determined. They realized that this would not end with polite explanations. Karen had begun to treat them as an adversary, someone to control rather than neighbor. That evening, the homeowner sat at the kitchen table, reviewing the pile of letters and emails that had accumulated over the past few weeks. Each one told the same story: Karen's insistence that the homeowner was in violation, regardless of facts. Each one was carefully worded to intimidate, to suggest consequences that might follow if the homeowner did not comply. The homeowner felt a knot of anxiety in their stomach. Despite the stress, they knew they had to take action. Ignoring the situation would not make it disappear. They began researching HOA laws, reviewing their own property documents, and speaking quietly with a lawyer friend. It became clear that while Karen had influence, the HOA itself had strict rules and legal obligations. The homeowner realized that if they could show they were in full compliance, Karen's threats could be challenged. This understanding brought a small measure of relief. The fight would be uphill, but it was possible to defend themselves. Days turned into weeks, and Karen's scrutiny intensified. Every morning, the homeowner would step outside with a sense of dread, half expecting to find another letter or notice. Every minor movement in the yard, every change in the garden, seemed to be observed. The stress weighed heavily. Sleep became restless, and casual interactions with neighbors felt tense. But through it all, the homeowner kept meticulous records. They took photographs, kept copies of correspondence, and logged each encounter. In the quiet moments of reflection, they reminded themselves that facts were on their side, and that truth could be a powerful shield against unreasonable accusations. The neighborhood, meanwhile, had begun to sense the growing tension. Some neighbors quietly offered support, sympathizing with the homeowner's plight. Others kept their distance, wary of Karen's sharp eye and potential for conflict. The homeowner, while grateful for the quiet encouragement, knew that ultimately they were facing this challenge alone. It was a personal fight, one that would require patience, strategy, and unwavering calm. One evening, as the sun set over the rooftops, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, the homeowner sat on the porch and reflected on the journey so far. They had moved to this neighborhood, seeking peace and community, and now they were engaged in a battle they had never imagined. Yet, amidst the worry and the uncertainty, there was a sense of determination. They would not be intimidated, they would not be bullied, and they would not allow the situation to escalate without a fight. Little did they know that Karen's overreach was only the beginning. The small complaints, the scrutinizing glances, threatening letters, all of it was leading to a moment that would change the course of their life. The quiet neighborhood, once a haven of calm, was about to become the setting of a conflict that tested patience, courage, and resilience. The homeowner understood that the coming days would demand everything they had: intellect, courage, and composure. And so, with a deep breath and a quiet resolve, they prepared themselves for the challenges ahead, knowing that the peaceful life they had cherished could be defended, but only if they stood firm. It was the first chapter of a story that would test boundaries, question fairness, and reveal the lengths to which one person would go to protect their home. And in the stillness of that evening, as the neighborhood settled into quiet routine, the homeowner made a silent promise to themselves: they would not back down. They would not be silenced, and they would see this through to the end. No matter how long or difficult the journey might be, after the first weeks of tense encounters. The situation began to escalate. What had started as small complaints and scrutinizing glances from Karen had now grown into something more serious. The homeowner woke up one morning to find yet another letter in the mailbox. This one was thicker, official, and stamped with urgency. Their hearts sank as they read the words slowly, each sentence carrying more weight than the last. The letter claimed that the homeowner was in severe violation of multiple HOA regulations and warned that if the situation was not rectified immediately, drastic measures could be taken, including the possibility of auctioning the property. The homeowner sat down heavily on the porch swing, trying to process what they had just read. Auctioning their home? It sounded unreal. They had always followed the rules. Every payment had been made on time. Every guideline carefully observed. How could this happen? Panic began to creep in, but they knew they needed to stay calm. Reacting impulsively would only make things worse. Before responding to the letter, the homeowner decided to review every detail. They pulled out their files, carefully organized stacks of documents, receipts, and correspondence they had saved over the years. They had photos of the garden, records of payments, notes from past HOA meetings, and copies of every communication with both the HOA and neighbors. Everything was in order. Nothing they had done could possibly be considered a violation. Yet, the threat remained. Karen had somehow convinced the HOA board, or at least a portion of it, that the homeowner had broken rules serious enough to justify auctioning their home. The tension began to take a toll. Nights became restless, filled with worry and uncertainty. The homeowner would wake up thinking about every possible scenario. What if the HOA actually went through with the auction? What if the lawyer they were consulting couldn't stop it in time? The fear of losing the home they had built, the safe haven they had cherished for so many years, weighed heavily. But beneath the fear was a growing determination. They realized that this would not end without action. They were determined to fight every step of the way. The first step was to gather more information. The homeowner began by reviewing the HOA rules thoroughly, line by line. They highlighted sections that confirmed their compliance and made notes of any ambiguous language that could be misinterpreted. They also researched the legal obligations of the HOA, looking for clauses that outlined proper procedures before taking severe action against a homeowner. The more they read, the more they realized that Karen's claims were not only exaggerated, but also potentially illegal. Next, the homeowner decided to reach out to the HOA board directly. They sent a formal email attaching all their documentation and politely requesting clarification. They asked the board to review the situation carefully, explaining that everything was in full compliance with the rules. They also requested a meeting to discuss the matter in person, hoping that a calm, factual conversation could resolve the situation before it escalated further. The response from the board was polite but non-committal. They acknowledged receipt of the documents but said that the alleged violations were under review. This vague reply did little to ease the homeowner's anxiety. It was clear that Karen's influence was strong, and the board seemed hesitant to confront her directly. The homeowner realized that they were facing a delicate challenge. Not only did they need to prove their compliance, but they also had to navigate a system that was being manipulated by someone with a personal agenda. Meanwhile, Karen continued her surveillance. She seemed to appear at the most unexpected moments, walking slowly past the property, clipboard in hand, making notes with a sense of purpose. The homeowner would sometimes catch her staring through windows, though she always quickly looked away when noticed. It was unsettling, a constant reminder that the fight was not only legal, but personal. Each encounter left the homeowner feeling a mix of frustration, anger, and determination. Seeking support, the homeowner began talking quietly with other neighbors. They were careful not to spread fear or gossip, simply asking for advice and sharing their experiences. Some neighbors had encountered Karen before and shared stories of similar harassment. One neighbor spoke of how Karen had forced small, harmless issues into major conflicts, often threatening fines or legal action over trivial matters. These conversations provided both comfort and validation. The homeowner realized that they were not alone in facing Karen's overreach, and that gave them a sense of strength. The homeowner also reached out to a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. The lawyer was calm professional, and reassuring. They explained that Karen's behavior, while aggressive, did not give the HOA legal grounds to auction a property without due process. They advised the homeowner to continue gathering evidence, documenting every interaction, and preparing for a potential formal hearing. The lawyer's confidence gave the homeowner hope they were not helpless, and the law was on their side if they approached the situation carefully and strategically. Despite this support, the homeowner could not ignore the emotional impact. Every day brought stress. Every letter or note from Karen or the HOA felt like a new threat. Mornings were heavy with anticipation, afternoons were tense with worry, and nights were restless with thoughts of worst-case scenarios. The homeowner found themselves walking the property multiple times a day, checking fences, gardens, and sidewalks, almost expecting to find a reason for complaint that was not there. The constant vigilance was exhausting, but necessary. They knew that Karen would seize on any minor imperfection, real or imagined, to justify her actions. As weeks passed, the homeowner noticed subtle changes in their own routine. They started scheduling their life around potential encounters with Karen, avoiding outdoor tasks at times when she was most likely to patrol. They stopped leaving tools or personal items outside, no matter how briefly. Even the smallest details, like a stray leaf on the lawn or a bicycle left on the driveway, became sources of anxiety. It was as though their life had become a careful performance, where every action could be scrutinized and judged. But amidst the pressure, the homeowner also discovered resilience they hadn't known they had. They became meticulous in documenting every step they took, every email sent, every interaction recorded. They created a detailed timeline of events, noting the date, time, and content of each letter, call, or visit. Photographs were taken daily, showing the property exactly as it was, highlighting the care and attention that had always gone into maintenance. They even started recording Karen's visits from a distance, making sure that any potential harassment could be proven if necessary. It was during this time that the homeowner realized an important truth. This was not just about compliance with rules. It was about standing up for themselves, protecting their home, and resisting intimidation. Karen's attempts to control the situation were personal, but the homeowner refused to be bullied. They began to feel a quiet determination, a sense that they could turn the situation around if they remained calm, methodical, and unwavering. One evening, as the sky turned shades of orange and purple, the homeowner sat on the porch and reflected on the events so far. They thought about the countless letters, emails, and visits, and how each one had chipped away at their sense of peace. Yet, they also thought about the small victories, the careful organization of documents, the support of neighbors, and the guidance of the lawyer. It became clear that knowledge, preparation, and patience were their greatest allies. The following days brought new challenges. Karen escalated further, sending emails to the board with claims that bordered on absurd. She alleged that minor imperfections in the landscaping were deliberate attempts to violate rules, that small outdoor decorations were non-compliant, and that the homeowner was uncooperative. Each email was carefully worded, designed to provoke a response and create a sense of urgency. The homeowner read them with growing frustration, but also with a calm determination. They knew that reacting emotionally would play into Karen's hands. Instead, they prepared measured, factual responses, always keeping a copy for their records. It was clear that a confrontation was looming. The homeowner knew that at some point, they would need to face Karen and the HOA board directly. They would need to present their evidence, demonstrate compliance, and expose the pattern of harassment. The thought was daunting, but also motivating. They began rehearsing what they would say, preparing to speak clearly and confidently, and imagining how to handle the inevitable pressure of the situation. Through it all, the homeowner found small ways to maintain sanity. They walked in the park, spent time with supportive friends, and focused on the aspects of life that were still calm and beautiful. Each evening, they reminded themselves of why they were fighting for their home, their sense of security, and their right to live without fear. These moments of reflection helped balance the stress and kept them focused on the path ahead. By the end of the second month, The situation had grown tense enough that the homeowner realized something critical. Karen was no longer just a neighbor enforcing rules. She had become a force actively trying to manipulate the system, using fear and intimidation to achieve her own goals. The homeowner understood that this was a battle that required both strategy and courage. They were determined not to let Karen's overreach define the outcome. And so, the homeowner continued. Each day was a careful balance of vigilance and resilience. Each interaction recorded and analyzed, each email crafted with precision. They knew that the next steps would be critical, that the looming threat of the HOA taking action could become very real, if not handled properly. But they also knew that standing firm, armed with facts, patience, and determination, was the only way to protect what mattered most. Little did they know that the coming days would test them more than ever, forcing them to confront not only Karen but the entire system that had allowed such overreach to occur. The homeowner's world, once calm and predictable, had shifted into a landscape of caution, planning, and quiet defiance. And yet, through the fear and uncertainty, a spark of confidence was growing, a belief that, with the right preparation and persistence, they could face the challenge head-on and emerge victorious. The stage was set. The minor complaints had turned into a serious threat. Surveillance had turned into intimidation. And Karen's determination to see her version of order prevail was stronger than ever. The homeowner had no choice but to prepare for confrontation. Armed with patience, evidence, and an unwavering sense of right, they knew the journey ahead would be long and difficult. But they also knew that defending their home was worth every effort. The homeowner knew that. Preparation was now more important than ever. The months of harassment, letters, and threatening messages had made it clear that this was no longer a simple disagreement. Karen's influence over the HOA board had grown, and if they did not act decisively, the threats could become reality. The thought of the board actually moving to auction the property was terrifying, but it also sparked a quiet determination. They understood that this fight required careful planning, evidence, and the support of people who could help. The first step was to gather even more evidence. The homeowner began reviewing every single interaction, every note, and every email with a meticulous eye. They organized a binder that contained everything in chronological order: payment receipts, previous HOA correspondence, photos of the property, and notes on Karen's visits. Every leaf, every fence repair, every decoration had been carefully documented to show that they had complied with every rule. It was tedious work, but the homeowner felt a growing sense of control. For the first time in months, they realized that knowledge and preparation could be as powerful as fear and intimidation. Alongside this, the homeowner began documenting the harassment itself. They started keeping a log of Karen's visits, noting the time, date, and what had occurred. Photographs were taken from a distance, showing her inspecting the property, clipboard in hand, sometimes with other HOA members following her lead. The homeowner knew that these records could be critical if the situation escalated further, and they wanted to make sure there would be no question about the pattern of harassment. Talking to neighbors became another important strategy. The homeowner quietly reached out to a few trusted residents who had witnessed Karen's behavior or had experienced similar harassment. Some neighbors had dealt with minor disputes that Karen had escalated. They were willing to share stories and offer support. Each conversation reinforced the homeowner's understanding that they were not alone and that Karen's behavior was not acceptable. These interactions also helped the homeowner prepare for potential discussions with the HOA board. As they now had examples of Karen's pattern of overreach to reference, the homeowner also leaned heavily on legal advice. The lawyer they had consulted previously became a constant guide, reviewing documents, advising on responses, and explaining the limits of the HOA's authority. They explained in detail how the HOA could legally enforce rules and what steps were required. For taking drastic measures like property auction, the homeowner listened carefully, asking questions and making notes. Every suggestion from the lawyer became a building block in the homeowner's strategy, a way to anticipate Karen's next move and counter it with facts and law. As the homeowner continued their preparations, they began to notice subtle signs of change in Karen's behavior. She seemed more frustrated, more determined, almost as if she realized the homeowner was no longer intimidated. Her visits became more frequent, but now she seemed to look for new ways to create conflict, scrutinizing details that no reasonable person would even consider. It was clear that Karen's goal was no longer just ensuring compliance. It was about control, proving that she had the power to manipulate the situation. The homeowner's resolve hardened. They knew they had to confront this challenge with calm, clarity, and strategy, and they refused to let fear dictate their actions. One morning, the homeowner decided to conduct a full review of the property with a critical eye. They walked the lawn, inspected fences, checked gardens, and even looked at small decorative items that could be criticized. Everything was documented with photographs and notes, showing that the property met every requirement outlined in the HOA guidelines. They even created a checklist, cross-referencing each rule with proof of compliance. It was exhausting work, but it gave them confidence. They could now say, without a doubt, that any claim of violation was unfounded. In addition to property documentation, the homeowner began compiling evidence of Karen's behavior specifically. They gathered statements from neighbors who had observed her pattern of harassment, noted dates and times of her visits, and even recorded interactions where she made threatening comments. The homeowner knew that when it came to legal or formal proceedings, demonstrating a pattern of harassment would be just as important as proving compliance. Every detail, no matter how small, became a part of the narrative they were building to protect themselves. The homeowner also prepared mentally. They realized that dealing with Karen would require patience, composure, and an ability to remain calm under pressure. They practiced what they would say in meetings, how they would respond to accusations, and how to maintain dignity even if confronted aggressively. They imagined scenarios where Karen tried to provoke them and rehearsed responses that were factual, polite, and firm. This mental preparation became as important as the physical evidence. If they lost their composure, it could undermine months of careful work. Meanwhile, Karen continued her campaign. She sent emails to the board, making claims that were increasingly exaggerated. Minor imperfections were described as deliberate violations, and she implied that the homeowner was uncooperative and untrustworthy. Each message was carefully crafted to sound urgent and serious, designed to pressure the board into action. The homeowner read each email with a mix of frustration and determination. They refused to react emotionally, instead drafting measured responses that emphasized compliance, factual records, and the importance of fairness. As the tension grew, the homeowner realized that they needed a clear plan for confrontation. It would not be enough to simply respond to letters and emails. They would eventually need to attend an HOA meeting, present their evidence, and demonstrate clearly why the claims against them were baseless. They envisioned a step-by-step approach: present proof of compliance, show documentation of harassment, reference legal guidance, and remain calm even if Karen tried to provoke conflict. This plan became a source of strength. They knew that preparation was their best weapon, and the clearer the strategy, the less room there was for fear. One day, a neighbor approached the homeowner quietly while they were tending the garden. She had watched Karen's behavior closely and offered advice. "You need to keep everything documented," she said. "She thrives on fear and chaos. The more organized and calm you are, the less power she has." Her words resonated deeply. The homeowner realized that Karen's strength came from creating panic and uncertainty. By staying composed, they were already beginning to take that power away. It was a small victory, but an important one. The homeowner also began preparing for worst-case scenarios. They imagined the board siding with Karen, the threat of fines, and even the possibility of legal action. For each scenario, they wrote down steps to respond, resources to consult, and evidence to present. They created a folder labeled Emergency Plan, ensuring that no matter what happened, they would have a path forward. The act of planning reduced anxiety. It was a reminder that even if the situation seemed overwhelming, it was manageable with careful, deliberate action. As weeks passed, the homeowner's confidence grew. They were no longer reacting out of fear, but acting with purpose. Each piece of evidence collected, each conversation with neighbors, each legal consultation became a building block in a defense that was becoming increasingly solid. Karen's threats, while still stressful, no longer held the same power. The homeowner understood that preparation, clarity, and persistence were stronger than intimidation. The homeowner also found support in unexpected ways. A few neighbors who had observed Karen's behavior quietly offered statements or tips on how to approach the board. Another neighbor shared their own experience of being unfairly targeted and advised on how to remain calm during confrontations. Each bit of support reinforced the homeowner's sense of community and reminded them that they were not isolated. This growing network of allies, however small, became another layer of protection and encouragement. During this time, the homeowner also discovered the importance of keeping a routine. They continued daily tasks, maintained the property, and engaged in personal hobbies and activities that brought peace. It was tempting to become consumed entirely by the conflict, but they realized that maintaining normalcy helped preserve mental strength. A balanced life allowed them to face each challenge with clarity and avoid being overwhelmed by fear or anger. One evening, the homeowner sat on the porch with their binder of evidence spread out. They reviewed each photo, each note, and each piece of correspondence carefully, ensuring that nothing was missing. They imagined the board meeting, visualizing themselves presenting calmly, clearly, and confidently. They rehearsed how to speak, how to counter any false claims, and how to present the pattern of harassment. With each review, their confidence grew. They felt more prepared, more in control, more certain that they could face Karen and the board without fear. And yet, the homeowner knew that the situation was far from over. Karen's persistence and determination meant that conflict was inevitable. The minor complaints of the past had already evolved into a serious threat, and only careful preparation would prevent escalation. The homeowner understood that patience, organization, and courage were their strongest tools. Each day, each action, and each piece of evidence brought them closer to the point where they could finally confront the situation directly. The stage was now set for the next phase of the conflict. Karen's influence over the HOA board had grown, her letters and emails had become more aggressive, and the homeowner had built a detailed, thorough case to protect themselves. The homeowner understood that the coming confrontation would require every ounce of preparation, patience, and composure they could muster. Yet, they also felt a quiet confidence. They had done everything possible to ensure that when the moment came, they would stand firm, armed with facts, proof, and the support of neighbors and legal guidance. The homeowner's journey through these months of stress and harassment had transformed them. They were no longer simply reacting to fear, they were acting with purpose. Every document, every photo, every conversation had become a tool to assert their rights and defend their home. Karen had sought to intimidate them, but the homeowner had turned that pressure into preparation, and in doing so, discovered strength and resilience they hadn't realized they possessed. By the end of this phase, the homeowner knew that the confrontation with Karen and the HOA board was inevitable. The months of documentation, careful planning, and mental preparation had set the foundation for a moment where truth, reason, and persistence would be the deciding factors. The homeowner felt ready. They were no longer simply a victim of harassment, they were an active participant in shaping the outcome, ready to defend their home, their rights, and their peace of mind. Little did they know, the coming confrontation would test them in ways they could never have anticipated. But with preparation, patience, and resolve, they were ready to face it head-on. The homeowner had discovered that even in the face of fear and intimidation, careful planning, persistence, and courage could turn the tide. And as they closed their binder and took a deep breath, they felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when the time came, they would be ready. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and the homeowner felt a mix of nerves and determination. They had spent weeks preparing, organizing every piece of evidence, rehearsing what to say, and imagining the possible challenges that could arise. Now, it was time to face Karen and the board directly. The quiet neighborhood that had once been a source of comfort now felt charged with tension. Every street and sidewalk seeming to whisper anticipation. The homeowner arrived early, carrying a thick binder of documentation and a folder with notes they had prepared. The meeting room was plain but formal, with rows of chairs facing a long table where the board members sat. Karen was already there, sitting with a clipboard in front of her, scanning papers, and occasionally glancing at the homeowner with a sharp, expectant look. She seemed calm, almost smug, as though she already expected the meeting to go in her favor. The homeowner, however, had done everything possible to be ready. They took a deep breath and reminded themselves that knowledge, patience, and composure were their allies. The meeting began with the board calling the session to order. Karen was invited to speak first, and she immediately began listing alleged violations. She pointed to minor imperfections in the lawn, small decorative items, and even temporary placement of a garden tool. Her tone was formal, but carried an unmistakable edge, a sense of personal vendetta that the homeowner could feel across the room. Each claim seemed designed to overwhelm and intimidate. But the homeowner remained calm. They listened carefully, taking notes and letting each point land without reacting emotionally. When it was their turn to speak, the homeowner stood slowly, projecting calm confidence. They opened the binder and began presenting evidence methodically. Photos of the property showed that every section complied with HOA rules. Payment records and maintenance receipts were displayed clearly. They explained each step taken to ensure compliance, from lawn care to minor repairs, highlighting how everything met the standards set by the HOA. Every point was factual, precise, and polite, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Karen tried to interrupt, her voice rising slightly as she attempted to discredit the evidence. She suggested that some photos were staged or that certain repairs had been delayed. The homeowner listened quietly, waiting until she finished before responding. They calmly explained the timeline, pointing to dates, receipts, and records, showing that everything was completed in accordance with HOA requirements. Their tone was measured, professional, and firm. There was no anger, no defensiveness, only clear, undeniable facts. As the homeowner continued, they began introducing evidence of harassment. They explained the pattern of Karen's behavior, referencing visits, letters, and emails. They read notes from neighbors who had observed Karen's actions, demonstrating that her claims were not only exaggerated, but also part of a repeated effort to intimidate and control. The board listened, some members nodding subtly. As the homeowner connected the dots between Karen's persistent scrutiny and the repeated threats that had escalated over months, Karen's smugness began to fade. She shifted in her seat, fidgeting slightly as the homeowner methodically presented evidence. Every attempt to provoke an emotional response was met with calm, reasoned replies. The homeowner did not argue. They simply presented facts and documentation, allowing the truth to speak for itself. It was a quiet but powerful tactic. In a room filled with tension and hostility, composure became their strongest weapon. The board asked questions, and the homeowner answered each one with clarity and precision. They explained why certain items were not violations, provided timelines for repairs, and demonstrated consistency with HOA rules. The homeowner also highlighted the lack of proper process in Karen's claims, showing that the board had been influenced by personal bias rather than objective evaluation. Each response reinforced their credibility and weakened Karen's position. At one point, Karen tried a final tactic, suggesting that the homeowner's cooperation was insufficient and that further action, including fines or other penalties, should be considered. The homeowner paused, took a deep breath, and responded calmly. They explained the steps they had taken to address every concern, how documentation had been provided in a timely manner, and how their actions demonstrated compliance and good faith. They emphasized that any punitive action based on unfounded claims would not only be unfair, but could expose the HOA to liability. The room fell quiet. The board members exchanged glances, clearly processing the information. For the first time, it was evident that Karen's influence had limits. Her arguments, once forceful and intimidating, now seemed less convincing in the light of thorough evidence and calm presentation. The homeowner's strategy had worked by remaining composed. Methodical and factual, they had turned the power dynamic in their favor. After reviewing the evidence, the board requested a short recess. The homeowner stepped outside to breathe, feeling a mix of relief and anticipation. They had presented their case, but the final decision was still in the hands of the board. They walked slowly around the building, taking in the familiar neighborhood streets, reflecting on the months of preparation, stress, and vigilance that had led to this moment. Each step reinforced a sense of quiet determination. They had done everything possible to protect their home and their rights. When the meeting resumed, the board addressed the homeowner directly. They acknowledged the thoroughness of the documentation and the clear evidence of compliance. They also recognized the pattern of harassment and improper influence. Noting that Karen's claims were unfounded and had escalated unnecessarily, the tone was formal but supportive, indicating that the board had been persuaded by the homeowner's evidence and composure. Karen protested quietly at first, then more vocally, but the homeowner remained calm, responding only when asked to clarify factual points. Their composure was unwavering, and the board repeatedly reminded Karen to maintain professionalism. It became clear that Karen's attempts to intimidate or manipulate were no longer effective. The homeowner had not only defended their property, but had also exposed the inappropriate behavior that had driven the conflict. Finally, the board made a decision. They ruled that all claims against the homeowner were invalid, that the property was in full compliance with HOA rules, and that any previous threats of fines or punitive action were to be rescinded. Karen was formally reprimanded for her conduct, with a note emphasizing that future harassment would not be tolerated. The homeowner listened as the decision was read, feeling a wave of relief and vindication. Months of stress, preparation, and perseverance had led to justice. After the meeting, the homeowner gathered their binder and notes, feeling a sense of quiet triumph. They had faced intimidation, harassment, and false claims, yet they had remained calm, methodical, and composed. The experience had been exhausting and challenging, but it had also revealed their inner strength. They realized that the combination of preparation, evidence, and composure could overcome even the most persistent attempts at intimidation. The homeowner returned to their property, walking slowly through the garden, observing every detail with a renewed sense of peace. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. For the first time in months, the familiar streets and houses felt calm again. They reflected on the journey, the early days of quiet enjoyment, the growing tension from Karen's scrutiny, the fear and anxiety of threats, and the eventual triumph through preparation and persistence. Each phase had been a test of patience, resilience, and courage. Neighbors who had witnessed the homeowner's struggle approached to offer congratulations and support. Some shared relief that the harassment was over, while others expressed admiration for the homeowner's determination and composure. The community atmosphere began to shift subtly, with a renewed sense of fairness and respect. Karen's influence diminished as the board's decision sent a clear message that personal vendettas could not dictate the lives of homeowners. The homeowner also reflected on personal growth. They had discovered a capacity for resilience, strategic thinking, and calm under pressure that they had not realized before. The ordeal had been stressful and exhausting, but it had also strengthened their confidence and resolve. They realized that standing up for oneself, even in the face of intimidation, is both necessary and empowering. In the days following the meeting, life slowly returned to normal. The homeowner maintained the property, interacted with neighbors, and resumed daily routines without the constant tension that had overshadowed their life for months. They continued to document minor interactions as a precaution, but the pervasive fear was gone. The sense of safety and control returned, and the homeowner felt grateful for the lessons learned through the experience.